Now, after 9/11, is that when the Title 50, right? The assassination law came into place, or because I'm very fuzzy on this, but I know that before 9/11, we had people over there in like Khartoum that were stalking bin Laden, right? Like particularly we had a guy, Billy Waugh, and a couple other guys that were like right across the street taking photos of them. Could have taken them out easily, but we couldn't legally do it. But after 9/11, something changed where.
I mean, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, go ahead.
My understanding, and I am not a lawyer, but Title 50 is the part of the U.S. code that covers the CIA and its intelligence operation. So it's not something that new that came along after 9/11. If you're going to conduct
executive action,
an operation, if you're going to ask the CIA to go and kill someone, there has to be a presidential finding for that. If you're asking them to do it, particularly in a non-combat zone. So if you want to kill somebody in Sudan, where the United States is not at war, there has to be a presidential finding signed by the president, usually briefed to the so-called Gang of Eight, which is a sort of the top intelligence committee and congressional leaders, the leaders of and ranking members of the intelligence committees in the House and the Senate, and the ranking the leader of the House, the leader of the Senate, and their counterparts from the opposition.
Right.
I'm not an expert on what Billy Waugh went through, but the way you've laid it out to me would suggest that there wasn't a presidential finding sign saying you can go and kill Osama bin Laden if you have him in your sights.
But from what I'm familiar with, is that something changed after 9/11, where they implemented this executive action, or this.
Well, certainly. There were all kinds of findings, I suspect, signed in the days and weeks after 9/11 to allow for that. I mean, obviously, Osama bin Laden was killed in Pakistan by U.S. forces. They were U.S. military forces, but they were operating under Title 50 authorities.
They were CIA, right? But they were.
Well, they were SEAL Team 6 and the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, but they were.
For that
officially
mission.
Under the authority of Leon Panetta, the director of the CIA.
Right. So it could be legal.
Yes, even though it was really a JSOC mission, it was being conducted. The moment that they sort of crossed the border into Pakistan, they came under the sort of Title 50 authorities.
It is super interesting, like how you classify a war crime. Right, like traditionally, it's been like if you're in combat and you're on a battlefield or you're in a desert and you're running around, you can shoot and kill somebody. But if somebody is sleeping in their tent at night, you can't go into their tent and slit their throat because it's considered a war crime.
I'm not sure if that's right. I think if the person into whose tent you're slipping is a military person,
right?
I think you're allowed to do that. I mean, you might have a bunch of military lawyers call in and tell you that's wrong, but I mean that's my understanding. If the person whose throat you're slitting is a civilian, and the reason you're slitting their throat is you just want to get a kill for some reason, as has been alleged and has occurred in. Maybe not throat slitting, but sort of, a bunch of deaths that were initially categorized in Afghanistan and elsewhere as sort of combat deaths, and then it turns out that in fact they probably weren't combat deaths, and that these were U.S. or coalition military personnel for some sort of fairly twisted reason wanting to kill somebody for the sake of killing them. So that's when it becomes a war crime. But generally, my understanding is if you're killing a member of the armed force with whom you're at war,
There's no rules.
the law is fairly broad about whether you can kill them or not. I mean, you can't. Once you've taken them prisoner, you can't kill them. If they surrender, you can't kill them. But if they're fighting you or they haven't surrendered, I mean, there's not really much difference in the way that, the scenario that you laid out of creeping into somebody's tent and slitting their throat. There's not an awful lot of difference between that and having a drone flying out of sight of them and zapping the building that they're in, or sending a missile into the car they're driving in.
Well, wouldn't this throat slitting be a much better option because you don't have collateral damage? If there's a terrorist in a building and you send a drone strike to hit it, you're going to potentially kill lots of people. And I know they justify it in ways like they rank the terrorist, how high they are up, and this is okay. We can kill this many civilians for this guy. But if you have some knuckle dragger mercenary who's just like thirsty for blood, who you can contract for the CIA to go out and slip into this guy's room and cut his throat and no one else gets hurt, wouldn't that be a better option?
Well, as a reporter, I'm certainly not about to sit here and say it would be a good idea to get some, quote, knuckle dragger mercenary thirsty for blood to go out and kill people. I mean, I think most Americans would hope that the folks that we're paying, that our taxpayers are paying to do this are not just because the phrase "thirsty for blood" it sort of implies.
I don't mean that in a negative way, by the way. I meant that in a good way because there's a lot of guys that are like that just they want to be in combat zones, right? Yeah. Or they want to be in war. Billy Waugh is a perfect example of that. It's way better than conscripting people, young kids, or not even talking. You don't have to go as far as conscripting them, like. Even just getting young kids who don't know what they want to do with their lives, they have the option of go to college, get a job, go join the military, and it's like, maybe this will be fun, and then they end up going over there and they're psychologically screwed for the rest of their lives. Instead of like the other option are the guys that are drawn to that, right? That want that, like the guys that really want to be there and doing these things. I feel like I don't know. I feel like that would be a much better option.
Well, I mean, let's assume that you can find those people. I suspect, and of course, there are people who come into the military wanting nothing more than to, be in the most sort of the units that are most likely to see combat, and and they want to be quite aggressive about it. The military is an enormous enterprise, and even for the combat arms elements of the Army, the Marine Corps, the Special Operations community, even it's and their equivalents in the Air Force and the Navy, it's doubtful that you can that there are enough folks coming into the military with that mindset to fill every single billet of those units. I mean, as you're probably aware, I don't know whether you've talked about it on the show before, but I mean, the military's spent the last 2 or 3 years in a recruiting crisis.
Right.
And, there are lots of factors behind that. But one of them is that only roughly 1 in 4 of, 18 to 25, I think, year-old Americans is actually qualified to join the military from the point of view of physical fitness, health, and not having a particularly criminal background, and so forth. That's before you start dividing that up amongst so-called what the military calls propensity to serve, which is how interested are those individuals going to be in serving in the military.
Right.
Only a quarter of the sort of the, if you like, the target audience for military recruiting ads, or only a quarter of the age group is even qualified. And then you've got to find the ones who want to serve there. Right. So I think as you drill down, the number of folks who, to sort of use a cliche, want to get their gun on, right, you know, in that group is fairly small.
Yeah, especially, yes. I mean, definitely in the younger generations, right?
But I do want to just go back to the business of
we were talking about
bloodthirsty mercenaries.
Yes.
I mean, you know, I think the term bloodthirsty to me, and I suspect
I might have embellished a
bit, sort of implies somebody who is not very discriminating. They want to see blood. They want to, you know, taste blood, literally. And you know, I think.
Let's just say a special operations guy with a dagger. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. Well, the special operations community, traditionally, one of its strengths has been its very arduous selection process, making sure that the right people with the right mindset are being selected into the community. I mean, there's countless examples in, just to use a Delta Force, you know, as a for instance, of folks who make it through the physical and psychological challenges of the so-called long walk, where they, you know, the candidates for Delta Force are, you know, taken to a forest basically in West Virginia and told to stop. You know, given a spot on the map that they have to go to, and they've got to navigate themselves through the terrain, get to that spot. There's somebody else there just saying, "Here's your next spot," and there's and there's a time that they're supposed to be meeting to get to the end, but they don't know where the end is and they don't know what the time is. So it's sort of a psychological thing. How do they handle that pressure? But there's countless examples of folks who have made it through that part of the challenge, that part of the assessment and selection process, and then there are psychological tests, and you know, and there's a panel of senior guys in the unit and graybeards, so-called, you know, former senior guys in the unit who are out now, assessing them, and a lot of them get rejected at those stages because they're not considered to be quite the right fit. And sometimes a psychologist will say, you know, they're looking for somebody who's ethical, you know. Now, look, there are flaws in every assessment. There are holes in this. Some folks will slip through the cracks in all of these organizations. So I'm not trying to say that any assessment and selection process has worked perfectly, right, whether that's Special Forces, whether that's Navy SEALs, whether that's SEAL Team 6, whether that's Delta Force, the Rangers. You know, you can find, you know, basically criminals who've snuck in or developed in those communities. Right. But where Special Forces has, or beg your pardon, Special Operations Forces has as an advantage over the rest of the military and most of the world's other militaries, is that they're so selective about this. Right. And you know, when you see communities that have, in the special ops world, that have, when you see organizations in the special ops communities that are having an uptick of problems, I would say it's usually worth going back to the selection process and see, have they allowed the selection process to get warped? Are they still selecting for the characteristics that they should have been selecting for or thought they were selecting for? Right. So, you know, I can't remember how we got onto this tangent, but I mean, it had to do with bloodthirsty mercenaries slipping into tents. I mean, I think that the moment that a nation starts using mercenaries, particularly foreign mercenaries, for operations.
What do you mean? I was talking about like American mercenaries.
Well, I mean, in history, a lot of mercenaries have been foreign, right? If you go back to the European wars in the Middle Ages and so forth, you know, they didn't all automatically answer to the head of state for whom they were fighting. That's why they had to go out, and that country or that kingdom or principality had to go out and hire them to fight for them. I mean, that was the sort of the definition of a mercenary. And you know, I think that you know, if a country has people fighting only for it, that, in other words, not fighting for that. I mean, the argument with folks like the Kenyan RRT that the U.S. government would make, and I'm sure the Kenyan government would make, is that, look, you know, yes, the United States wants Al-Qaeda figure X killed, but so do we. So they're, you know, the fact we're taking American help in terms of training and in terms of resources to help create this unit, maybe, or certainly train them up, and we're taking their intelligence to target them, but they're killing guys that the Kenyan government wants killed as well.
So it's good for Kenya as well.
Exactly. But if you're taking somebody from a country whose government has absolutely no say in it, maybe, or maybe that country isn't a democracy, so the people of that country have no say in it. You know, it's at least worth having a conversation about that in the United States, you know, which is why you need to have, you know, news organizations that cover it.
Right.